Thank you all for being with us today for our Bayou Culture Gathering. This is the fourth episode of our fifth season, and we are very excited to have all of you with us today. Just in terms of a little bit of housekeeping, I'd like to introduce our management team to all of you. Myself, I'm on there. My name is Jonathan Forey. I'm the executive director of the South Louisiana Wetlands Discovery Center. We also have Dr. Rachel Doherty, who is over at the Center for Louisiana Studies at ULL, and she also represents the Louisiana Folklore Society. We have Maria Zarang, who is she is the director of the Louisiana Folklife Program over at the Louisiana Division of the Arts. And Dr. Gary LaFleur, fish expert, is over at the Center for Bayou Studies at Nicholls State University. And our staff, Maida Owens, who's a senior program consultant, and Dr. Shauna Walton, who is our project coordinator. We bring this slide to you. We always put this up here just to share why culture. Why is it important to have culture in planning? We have this photo for you. This is at a recent Passing It On workshop where Mr. Carl Parfait has been teaching folks how to make trawl nets, which is it's been a very successful program for us. One of the things that you'll see today with our presentation is the value of culture. And we have Dr. Austin with us that was charged with that very question of, how do you put a value on those cultural practices? So we're happy to have her here today to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you so very much to our funders. We couldn't do this program without them. Thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts, the M.J. Sindler Family Fund for Culture and Media, the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development through the Division of the Arts, and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. I would now like to pass this over to Maida to talk a little bit about the Artist Spotlight.
Yeah, Maria Zarine couldn't be with us today, but she shared with me about this. The Czech heritage dancers are outside of in the former Czech community in near Alexandria, and they got a passing it on grant to bring to work with the Covanda Band in Houston, and the Covanda Band. Um, sent recordings for them to work with, and then was able to actually be there at the Czech Heritage Festival. And that was the first time that they had ever been able to dance with a live band. So they're really excited about that. And if you want to see them, you can also see them at the Natchitoches Folk Festival in Natchitoches in July. But we're real proud of this one.
Thank you so much for that. All right, so today's agenda, what we're looking to do is we will hear from Dr. Austin momentarily. We will have some time for questions during her presentation, actually, and then we will ask her our question with the theme for this year, which is about reclaiming the human connection. We'll have a few working group updates, any announcements from our listeners, and then we'll invite everyone to the informal discussion that takes place at the end of this to 1:30. So I'd like to introduce all of you to Dr. Austin. If you don't know her already, Dr. Diane Austin is an applied environmental anthropologist whose work focuses on community dynamics amid large-scale industrial activity and environmental change, alternative technologies and education to increase environmental, social, and community justice, and community-based collaborative research and outreach. She has more than 25 years of experience managing large interdisciplinary and multi-year projects, developing and implementing collaborative research and outreach approaches, and serving as an advisor to local, state, and tribal governments and consortia in the United States and Mexico. She has developed and maintained long-term multi-sectoral and community-based partnerships with Native American communities, U.S. and Mexican border communities, and communities along the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. At the University of Arizona, she has coordinated the Bureau of Applied Research in Anthropology internship program for almost 3 decades, developed Barra's post-baccalaureate program, and supported hundreds of students and emerging researchers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diane Austin, who will be presenting today Restoration Justice, Identifying and Addressing Cultural Harm. Thank you so very much, Dr. Austin, for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I am pulling up my slides now to get started. I first want to just thank all of you all for being here. I know some of you on looking at who's here, and it's just a real pleasure to be able to speak with you. Though I've spent most of my career at the University of Arizona, I was fortunate and have been fortunate to spend over 25 years in the southern Louisiana and Gulf of Mexico region, working with colleagues from Arizona, but also, again, some of you on this, here attending today, and other folks, both in universities and governments across the Gulf region, primarily documenting the sociocultural impacts of the offshore oil and gas industry on individuals, households, families, and communities. Now, the idea of this presentation actually came from a conversation that Jonathan and I were having when I was in Louisiana last December. And as you can see, on this introductory slide here, I've put 2 dates that the reason we decided April was a good month for this presentation is that we are at the 10th and 16th anniversary, if we would call it that, of 2 events that are very significant in this, related to the topic that I'm going to talk about today. And I want to highlight that those several important decisions related to deepwater drilling in the Gulf of Mexico have been made since December. This presentation focuses on the historical events and responses and is intended to spur reflection and discussion about culture, and particularly the application of the concepts of cultural harm and restoration or restorative justice. Now, just for everybody's sake, in terms in this presentation, culture is defined as products of human work and thought, resulting in a system of knowledge, beliefs, institutions, patterns of behavior that are created, shared, learned, and contested by a group of people. So that lays the groundwork. So the impetus for this presentation was my experience serving as an expert witness in the penalty phase of the U.S. Department of Justice trial to establish the penalties that BP would pay under the Clean Water Act for releasing millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. I was contacted by the Department of Justice in 2014 due to research, which, as you can see on the slide, spans at that time was almost 2 decades. My University of Arizona colleague, Tom McGuire, and I had been conducting, along with colleagues from universities in the region, but also students, dozens of communities, community collaborators, which include school teachers, librarians, tribal leaders and members, leaders of NGOs. In other words, lots of folks who are expert right there in the community as well. Now, our research produced many technical reports that are archived, actually, thanks to Gary and others at the Center for Bayou Studies at Nicholls. But in addition, to meet our responsibility for getting information back to the communities where we work, we prepared and shared traveling exhibit websites. We have a collection of over 700 oral history interviews from folks in the region, educational curricula, in other words, videos, the idea to make sure that we could get the information back to people who could use it. I will say, though, we did not anticipate assuming the role of expert witness in a federal trial. So before I go into more details on the trials, the basis for that was our work in the region on the offshore oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was funded by the Minerals Management Service, which became the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to inform their environmental and social impact analyses. Now, given how deeply embedded the oil and gas industry is in the region, tracing literally the origins of offshore oil and gas industry to that region where the industry literally, we called it, walked offshore across the shallow outer continental shelf. So given all of that, a key objective and outcome of our research was to really expand the notion of who works offshore and what does it mean to be involved offshore, bringing into that conversation a lot of folks who actually work onshore, but their work, like for the fabricators, is very largely tied to the industry. The top left figure here is basically to just get you a sense of what we do here, which is to try to understand how people experience, in this case, the oil and gas industry, the kinds of things that drive their decisions about participating or not, everything from the economic cycles, the booms and busts, as we call them, the work schedules, but also their satisfaction in the industry. And all of those are couched within those societal cultural expectations that people have, everything from expectations to parents and their availability to their children. This industry for people who work offshore requires them to be gone for long periods of time. Also other opportunities in the region, and what's the overall economic picture. So in that context, key has been the very strong individual, household, and community level identity that has long tied people to this industry and also continues to evolve. So what happens when an industry that has such an important historic, economic, and sociocultural role in the region has a disaster that, while not unimagined, was certainly not expected? When the disaster began, we pivoted from a study that we had going on, ironically, on the history of the Deepwater era, which began in the 1990s, to focus on the disaster and its impacts. Now, clearly, the disaster, as you can see from this slide, we always refer to this as a series of events. There was an explosion, there was a spill, but as you can see, many other things happened as well. And the disaster continued to morph and manifest itself across the region, making very clear ties between industries such as the oil and gas industry, fishing industry, tourism, but also overlapping consequences of land loss, hurricanes, the spill, other spills, and oil that shows up in wetlands and water bodies, and much, much more. So as anthropologists, we came to southern Louisiana in the same way we first enter any community. We have a general understanding of communities and how they function, but very little locally specific knowledge. As one fisherman summed it up for me in probably my first visit there, he looked at me, I'm explaining what we're doing, and he says, "What are you people from Arizona doing here? You don't even have any water." Well, he's right. And 18 years later, we still don't have any water. But by the time I received the call from the Department of Justice, we had a deep understanding of the complex relationships of the places and peoples in the region with the oil and gas industry. Now, my role in the trial, as you can see, all the way at the bottom of this list when the Clean Water Trial came about, was to focus on the sociocultural effects on people. Now, today, an ongoing question, which we'll get to later, is the question of whether restoration and the way it's playing out is another phase in the disaster, or is it a process of addressing the harm that the disaster caused? So to help us move forward, many of you were in the Gulf region. Some of you were part of these studies from the start of the BP disaster. So even if you came more recently or not in the region at this point, I asked you to think about, from your perspective, in what ways did the Deepwater Horizon disaster cause cultural harm? Going back to how we're thinking about culture, and would ask you to share those with the group if you're willing. Either put your thoughts in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and Jonathan or somebody will call on you, and we'll share those with the group and just broaden all of our understanding of the ways this connection between that disaster and cultural harm. So I'll take a few minutes to do that.
I'll start off by sharing, but please, if you'd like to share as well, please, raise your hand. We'll recognize you, or as Diane mentioned, you can write anything in the chat. Um, I remember my dad who really enjoyed oysters. I mean, this man had a sack of oysters in the back of his truck and traveled with it to be able to put the tailgate down at any given moment and share oysters with whomever was there after work or whatnot. And he did not feel comfortable eating oysters for 2 years after the spill because he was worried about the dispersants and the oil that may have contaminated the oysters. So I know that it impacted him in terms of what he could eat. And I think his story was very similar to a lot of the other folks' story that they had one foot in each industry. So my dad had a trawl boat and enjoyed seafood, but he also worked in the oil industry because they had good paying jobs to be able to provide a livelihood and provide us, food on the table. And so it was really challenging, I think, for him to navigate how he felt about the spill. Because in one part, he was participating in something that provided money to pay the mortgage on the house, but then it also took away the joy of those cultural practices. And so navigating how how you're supposed to feel about that was difficult. But that's what I mean. If anybody else has things to share, we'd love to hear from you as well. I see Gary mentioned it seemed to insert a wedge within many communities where some people received more penalty funds than others. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I also, yeah, I didn't think about that. Some people, there was the term called spillionaires, and it was folks that really made a lot of money off of the oil spill. And that was the term. They were spillionaires because, and that did create a wedge within some folks. Um, Robin says family livelihood, way of life, environmental despair. Gary says, I remember thinking that the oil spill will never end. For that spring, it was hard to tell if it would ever be fixed. I agree with that. I remember that as well. So thank you all for sharing a few things. Jessica mentions I worked on the social impacts report with Diane and others, and I remember a family whose kids had never had any health issues suddenly had asthma, and the parents were nurses and worried that they may need to move and were devastated. Yeah, yeah. So thank you all for that. And I'll hand that back over to Diane.
Okay, well, thank you all. What we're going to do now is look at how what you shared here in 2026 corresponds to key findings from the January 2015 trial. But before doing that, I want to give you a quick visual of one rich form of data that we collected. As expressions of culture, images such as these capture some ways that the disaster became a focal point for both supporting and questioning the role of the industry in the region, but also the role of other institutions such as governments, law firms, festivals, and more. And so with that in mind, we'll now move to my testimony. And these are the two major key findings. If you haven't done this, and the work of translating academic work into a trial is a lot. And the folks that I worked with, the attorneys, get a lot of credit for helping us narrow, especially anthropologists. We always say we like to complicate things. Well, you have to get things pretty clear to present at a trial. So literally, these are the two key findings. First, that the disaster caused serious and widespread sociocultural harm, and then that BP's experts trivialized that harm to the Gulf communities. So if we look at even the responses that came in, and hopefully things that are in you all's heads as well, many of what came up are exactly things that we brought up. This widespread disruption of livelihoods and changes to those patterns of seasonal living, the exacerbation of social and economic inequality within the region, the challenge to that individual and collective identity. Jonathan, Gary was mentioning that sense that, well, I identify with this industry, but now look what's happening here. The disruption in social relationships, and again, increased divisiveness. The Spillionaires was one of many ways that divisiveness appeared for communities. And then for those of you who were involved and still are maybe with local governments and NGOs, in many ways disempowered by the fact that a lot of decisions were being made elsewhere, a lot of money coming into the region, and people not actually able to participate. Now, importantly, when I was first asked to serve as an expert witness, I was told my testimony would likely be on the last day of the trial. In Clean Water Act trials, sociocultural impacts have tended to take a back seat to impacts to ecosystems, direct impacts on species that are exposed to contamination and pollutants. Over time, the Department of Justice and EPA attorneys recognized that BP's attorneys were growing concerned about my testimony as they tried to get me disqualified as a witness on several occasions. Nevertheless, we persisted, and following 5 months of preparing reports, responding to the challenges from BP's attorneys and my deposition, I ended up being the second witness in the penalty phase of the trial. And I think that's an important point to think about how, well, we'll tack on sociocultural at the end, but because of the way that it resonated, and again, because of the response and the concerns about it, it moved up in the trial. So I want to take us now out a step to look at, well, how is cultural harm? How has it been defined? And put these two definitions, there's others out there from two different sources, just to think about this question of what does it mean given the definition of culture. And I point out the role of community, collective identity, beliefs, and practices. And our ethnographic data certainly illustrated how the effects of the disaster emerged, were interdependent, and evolved as the disaster unfolded. Now, for me, the process of testifying was terrifying, but I survived largely because not only was I well prepared, thanks to the research of many people over the years and the confidence that I had in that, but also because of the U.S. attorneys with whom I worked. And I want to give a shout out to them. They had been involved in all of the phases of the trial. So it had to become expert in everything from blowout presenters to the impacts of oil on species to now sociocultural harm and what it means. And they had dedicated years of their lives to the case and were both eager and enthusiastic learners. They had the confidence that the data we had should and would stand up in court. So in the end, the totality of evidence presented at the trial resulted in what remains as the largest Clean Water Act settlement in U.S. history. Most of the funding from the settlement was dedicated to addressing natural resource damages and environmental restoration. I have a quote from Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker at the time that this came out, and I quote, "With this settlement, federal, state, and local governments and the Gulf Coast communities will have the resources to make significant progress toward restoring ecosystems, economies, and businesses of the region," unquote. Well, that leads to the next question. Is restoration and borrowing from the concept of restorative justice possible? Is restorative justice possible through restoration? Because of the close ties between cultures of the Gulf region, the unique environment, and the oil and gas industry, I'm drawn to think about the notion of restorative environmental justice. And you can see the definition here from the European Forum for Restorative Justice. Now, the concept of restorative justice is typically applied to individual acts. I harm you, I steal from you because you are in my community and I seek to restore our relationship. I come up with some form of restoration for you. All right, in the case of the BP disaster, with the enormous and widespread impacts and the monetary fines to address them, I think it's a good moment to ask, has the process offered a measure of restorative justice? So I want you to hold that in your head, because I'm going to go through some information about the revenues, what they've been used for, et cetera, and come back to that question. Now, I put this definition on the last slide, so you don't have to memorize it, but I want you to have it in your head as I walk through some of these next slides, okay? So first, the BP, again, large settlement for the environmental sides of things, was a little over $18.5 billion. But I want to put it in context. This comes from a website, Macro Trends, and they track lots of companies. And so this is the information they have on BP since 2012. You'll notice the average revenue dipped in 2016 with the settlement and the starting of the payouts, but $186 billion a year. And you'll notice that with the ups and downs, their revenue in 2025 was just a little bit greater than that. The next one does quarterly revenue. Their fourth quarterly revenue for 2025, $47.7 billion. And the profit alone for last year was $7.5 billion. Now, I draw your attention to the text on the side, and particularly the end of that quote. This is text directly off the website that says basically how they paid for the litigation and other expenses. They embarked on a massive asset divestment program, relied significantly on debt capital. And then, as it states, BP, now this is as of early 2026, successfully settled all litigation with the relatively insignificant cash outlays remaining. That means the money is out there. So that leads us to the question, so what's it being spent on? This website, now I have the web link, and Jonathan, somebody will post it in the chat for you as well, is the Deepwater Horizon project tracker. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what I want to point out here is they have this information. Which of those funding programs are ongoing still, and which ones have already finished? Some of you may have received grants from some of these programs or may be familiar with them. It just gives you a sense of where the process is with actually spending the money from the settlement. Now, if we go forward, here is this project tracker. I've put up at the top that those are the logos of the 4 organizations that are behind this and keeping it up to date. Folks who have received funding are asked to submit information, and then it's tracked. But I draw your attention to the categories. Environmental is a large category here, but there are also categories: recreational use, human and social, just the whole concept of science for additional studies, etc. Now, this gives you an idea of what's funded under recreational use. Now, I have to tell you that unfortunately, I went on this site like last week to just update some stuff and found out that now you actually have to have ArcGIS to access the data. So that's something new. You used to be able to just jump on and go look at it, but hopefully that people have access, or if you wanted to see stuff and needed access, get in touch. I have my contact information at the end. Gives you an idea of how this is organized. You can search by state, you can get all kinds of information. And then I pull up the ones for the human and social projects, just to give you a sense here. 65 projects with a total dollar value so far of $63.5 million. That's out of the 18.5 billion that are being tracked through this mechanism. So that's to give you a sense of what this is all about. So I now am going to turn it back to you to another question. Or first I want to raise another question, and that is, how do you evaluate the success of the projects? This can report the projects, but how do we evaluate their success? And so if we look here, we see that the National Academy's Gulf Research Program has a committee that's charged with this task, and this is from their 2022 report. All right. And a couple of things jump out at us here. First of all, the lack of meaningful post-Deepwater Horizon synthesis. Now, they explain that, as you can see, for a couple of ways. One, gee, it's hard. It takes time. The Gulf of Mexico is exceedingly complex by many measures. And interestingly, and I thought would be of interest to this group, in contrast to other US continental coasts, no regional entity has been charged with carrying out synthesis or has stepped forward to do it. What that means is you've got a lot of individual projects, and as you can see with the next information, at the end of 2021, when about half of the monies had been spent or committed, there were 570 environmental restoration projects underway. What's not being looked at if you don't do synthesis is when I do my restoration project down the beach from your restoration project, is this a synergy, or are we canceling each other out? How are these projects being looked at in relation to each other? And the kind of concluding one of the conclusions, as it says, and I quote, in the absence of sufficient scale of restoration activities, cumulative impacts of restoration may not be measurable or may prove to be easily obscured by background variability. So I guess it comes back to us. In the absence of any external assessment, I ask you, in what ways have you experienced or observed what we could consider restorative environmental justice in the wake of the BP disaster? And again, I put down at the bottom, what are those elements? Stop damaging, repair and heal, and hopefully build different systems that keep us from moving into that area. So thinking about that, and really eager to hear what ways that you have seen projects, you may have been involved in some of them. And then the next question is, what role do the local and regional cultures and communities play in helping or realizing restorative environmental justice? So I say we take a few minutes and think about this.
It's such a hard question, right? Gary, I see that you've unmuted. If you're willing to kind of tackle a little bit, or what are your thoughts on that?
There's things, tangible things that you can point to in Terrebonne Parish that are just so minuscule, but like this. All of a sudden, we had pretty signage that said Chauvin this way, or
Mm,
this is the
mm,
village of Cocodrie. I can remember that
mm.
that popped up after after the
Yeah,
BP oil spill, and you kind of thought, well, I guess I guess this is part of the penalties, and
yeah,
it was in some, it makes you kind of feel like I don't think this is really helping the people, but you can imagine them checking off a box, maybe.
yeah. I remember, I guess it's the sustainability of it all is the challenging part because we live on a delta and we live on a delta as sea levels are rising and land is sinking, and that's just a really complicated thing with or without oil spills. To Gary's point, I remember there was a lot of money that came to the parish to do um, events, like cultural events, to try to bring people together. And it was, they started the Best of the Bayou, which was a festival, and it lasted until the money ran out. They did it year after year and had a really huge budget. And it was successful while there was money there, but when there was no money left to fund it, it dissolved and went away. So, was it good during that time? Absolutely. But it wasn't sustainable. And I think that there's part of it that speaks to all of the other projects, like the infrastructure projects of levees and marsh creation projects that the fines enabled us to do are certainly helpful. It buys us a little bit more time, but how sustainable will that be into the future when all the fine money has been spent? And I know one of the things, and I'll ask Jessica Sims if you're up for it or not, and because I feel like you may know a little bit more about this than I do in terms of the Coastal Master Plan. So I think that one of the things that at least Louisiana has going for it is the Coastal Master Plan. Um, Takes into account the symbiotic nature of some of the projects and says, well, if we do this, this will impact this project in this way, and it'll be beneficial. So that gives more value to these projects, and we should do these versus projects that may interfere with each other that may not be as beneficial.
The people on the call, we see the money. It goes through the National Academy of Sciences, the Gulf Research Program, goes through the Restore Act, the things that Diane just listed. Like, Nichols has benefited. Like, we got a boat, and the boat has students on it, and those students often were in affected families. So, if I had to list some things, I do see how some of it works, but to say that it restored the environmental justice of the region, I mean, that's hard. I think that's what Diane's talking about. It's hard to measure, and it's hard to really say, oh yeah, that got restored. It's easier to restore a marsh and say, oh yeah, that marsh, it got restored, but man, to restore culture is pretty hard thing to show.
Yeah.
I saw Maida had something to say.
Ada, yeah.
Um, I could be wrong on this, but my understanding is that some museums receive funding. I think the Children's Museum in Thibodeau, so that would have been something that continued. I quickly looked at their website and I don't see an acknowledgement of that funding. But then this was, you know, quite a long, how long would you need to include that on your website of how it started? Um, but that is something that events, the date passes, but if you give it to facilities, that money has more impact or
Mm,
long-term impact.
mm. Thank you for that. Diane, we'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Again, this is a very high bar to reach to say, is there restorative environmental justice? And so it's not surprising that it's like you can't come up with a lot. I think it is important to just recognize that even at the highest levels, to your point, Jonathan, one thing real quickly, Victoria Faniff, who got her PhD at U of A, worked with us on projects and worked for BOEM for a while, is now with another federal agency. She and I published actually something only a few years into this that was looking at the question of which of the states were best prepared to take money. And Louisiana, by far and away, because of QIPRA or the CPRA, because of the other channels, was in a better shape than we were looking at Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So that's something also that is not surprising. It does, raise this question when you have a state that's that well prepared at some level, even the challenge at that point, which again gets to, the very the bottom, the third of these, which is let's build different systems. Let's prevent the sociocultural harm. Because if it's hard to restore and if it's hard to get back to, we have a lot of conversation about, marsh restoration and can you really restore a marsh back to what it was or an ecosystem, and bringing in this notion that also it's really hard to restore cultures and communities after the fact as well, and how to do a better job maybe of protecting them. So basically that, in that light, first I'm look forward and would love to be in communication with anybody. There's my email address. Also in 2017, my colleagues Lauren and Tom McGuire published an article that looks from an anthropological point of view at what it meant to put essentially our primary research approach, which is ethnography on trial, which is what this was. The reason BP was trying to use the Daubert motions to get it disqualified was as unscientific, and that I was not qualified, and the judge overruled that motion and let it move forward. So that was a good sign for anthropology. That's why that article was published. But if you're interested in looking at it, Jonathan will put that in the chat. And then I feel it's only appropriate to end with one of the more famous quotes from an anthropologist, because it still rings true. And never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So with that, I wrap this up.
Thank you so much for that, Diane. We really appreciate you being here to share that information with us. One of the things that I was also thinking of in terms of the impacts of the oil spill was also the impacts, at least in this area, of Hurricane Ida. And I know that we're talking about, man-made versus natural events. But I just think it's such a challenge when we're constantly recovering from something. And after each of those impacts, the community changes a bit in a different way. And so, in thinking of restorative justice, another one of the challenges I think that we face is restoring it to what point in time, it's sort of like Ida took us a little further back than we may ever be able to reach from BP times. And maybe there'll be another storm, hopefully not anytime soon, that will take us a little bit further back than reaching where we were from Ida. And I'm I would love to be able to figure out a system, maybe system is a strategy that we would be able to implement to maybe lessen that each time, figure out a way to, but it just all seems to be happening very haphazardly, organically, and maybe that's the only way that it happens. And maybe that's the way that it should happen. Anyway,
Yeah,
the
two
philosophical
real quick
pondering.
points, and
Yeah,
then I will let you keep because there's more to do. But
sure.
um, one is you mentioned the difference between man-made or human-made and quote natural disasters. Basically, we're now looking to argue that hurricanes are also not natural disasters, in the sense that if we think even just in policy, what raises something to the level of disaster is how much damage it causes. And a lot of the impacts of hurricanes may or may not come in and strike, but what happens as a result of a hurricane and the processes that put certain people in harm's way and not others, and all of those kinds of things are definitely human caused as well, so that we recognize that these are much more tied together. And then finally, to your point of restoring to what, because that's a great point, because we asked that question on the environmental side, what are we going back to in a wetland or in a stream bed, et cetera. But there's also the recognition that ecosystems, but especially cultures, are always evolving. And so you're not trying to take people back to a time when my great grandfather was alive and did X, Y, and Z, but trying to get back to those core elements of a functioning culture, which is that there are systems of beliefs and knowledge. One of the key impacts of the Deepwater Horizon disaster was just eroding trust that people had in anybody, and in government, in other institutions, in their communities, et cetera. And we don't function well when we don't have trusted sources of information that we can turn to. And some of that today we recognize just with the many ways that people get their information, the internet, how people use social media, that's a much larger question than just in the Gulf region. But it really gets back to, again, how do local communities and cultures challenge that? in a way that allows people to find they have those trusted sources of information when something happens and who to turn to.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Um, I would like to now ask you a question that we ask all of our presenters, and that is along with our theme for this year about reclaiming the human connection. And if you could share one strategy that you think that we can all use to reclaim human connection.
Well, that's a really tough question. And I was hoping I'd get more answers to that from you all. I know you guys have a lot more in your heads these days and would love to hear what you're thinking. But I would take it back to the fact that the region, the people in the region are so tied to that other than human environment outside of your doors and outside in wetlands and on the water, on the shrimp boats, etc. And that many people are still fortunate to have access to that. If we think around the world and we think even in this country, large urban areas, et cetera, there are a lot of people who don't even have access anymore to the kind of places that you do. And because of that close tie between the cultures and those places, a lot of practices have been built up to bring people together in those spaces. You mentioned, festivals, and festivals are very important, but also hey, jump on, I love the conversation that you and Gary were having at the beginning, and the brown shrimp and white shrimp, and I got to go out on a shrimp boat, only not overnight, not all of that, but just to go out and experience. They knew better than to trust me to do anything right, but at least here's what goes on. But those opportunities to be out together in a place that, we were asked to put together a project for a group in the region that included the sounds of the bayou. So we had a videographer out recording the birds taking off over the bayou and those other places, because that's part of what ties. And so I would say doing that with somebody else and getting people to get away from all those things that keep us from showing up at stuff really it's that back to small group of people, person by person and group by group, being able to continue to have those opportunities.
Yeah, that's beautiful. As you were talking, I thought exactly about what Gary and his team are doing over at the Sculpture Garden for the boat blessing. It's important. It really is. So thank you for that. Thank you, and thank you for being with us today, Dr. Austin.
Thank you all.
If you have any questions, though, please stick around for the informal part of our discussion today, and we'll continue that conversation. So, a little bit more of housekeeping. This is our BCC group schedules. We've got our French language preservation group that now meets quarterly. We'll be meeting in June, and that June 26th on the second Tuesday at 6 p.m. So if you would like any information about that, please contact us as well. Protecting Collections with PUD meets on the third or fourth Thursday of the month at 2. Culture and Coastal Planning with Erin is the third or fourth Monday of the month at 2. And Preparing Receiving Communities with Madeline and Rachel is on the third or fourth Wednesday of the month at 2. And so if you're interested in those topics, we'd encourage you to join one of those groups, and you can get more information on those through our Facebook page or just contacting us here at the Discovery Center. We hope that you will join us for our next gathering. That will be May 22nd, again at noon with Jesse Keenan. And so he will be presenting North, the Future of Post-Climate America. We hope that you will be able to join us then. And so a little bit more information about what's happening here with the BCC. There were recent workshops. One was at the Louisiana Cultural Resource Management Network in Hammond, and Leaving and Belonging Symposium, which is at the Institute for Immigration Research over at George Mason University on April 18th. So thank you very much to Maida and Shauna for making those things happen. Over here at the Bayou Terrebonne Waterlife Museum, we will be presenting Louisiana Lit, which is going to be Thursday, May 22nd at 6. Bayou Feasting Through the Seasons of a Cajun Life is a cookbook. That was the second cookbook written by Melissa Martin, who's a native of Chauvin. Really an amazing author. In my list of things that I put in my trunk of traditions, her cookbooks go in them because they're just so well done that the photos are beautiful and the narrative is amazing as well. So we ask that you all stick around until 1:30, and that concludes the formal part of this month's presentation. Thank you all so very much for being with us.